Hi, this is Misha, and this video is on British service sidearms. In my hand is a Webley Mark V. Webley and Scott Mark V. These are pretty famous today. Kind of an iconic gun. Very, they're based on the old Smith & Wesson top brakes. They fire a .455 cartridge, which is slow and massive. It was developed from a black powder cartridge. They are a double, single action only. That's about it. Fixed sights, the revolver. Well, the Mark I Webley was released in November of 1887, and it fired a .455 black powder cartridge, as I said, and it was basically a development of several civilian revolvers that Webley and Scott have been working on, like the Webley Prize and the Webley Government and so on and so forth. Prior to this, they had purchased a license to manufacture top brake Smith & Wesson, so that's kind of where the whole design came from. Well, that one came out in 1887, and they wanted the first 10,000 within a few months, so they were going into service pretty quickly. They had a desperate need for them. Well, I'm not going to get into too much of the details of all the little marks, but in 1895, the Mark II came out, and essentially it was stronger. Then in 1897, the Mark III came out. It was stronger. It also had a removable cylinder, well, a cylinder that could be removed in the field, I should say. End-user serviceable. Then in 1899, the Mark IV came out, and this was known as the Boer War model. Quite a few were purchased by officers for that war, and actually the Mark IV remained in service through the early stages of World War I. Even though it was still firing a black powder cartridge, it was a robust revolver. All these early ones had a 4-inch barrel like this one does here, and they all had kind of a bird's head type grip. Kind of an old Western style gun for that era. Well, after the turn of the centuries, the British were starting to use smokeless powder, and that's when this one here, the Mark V, came out in 1913. This was released, and these were supposed to replace all the older ones like the Mark IIIs and the Mark IVs. But when war broke out a year later, quite a few of the old ones are still in service, and the first 30,000 of these were delayed in production. So that's why the Mark IVs remained in service. But yeah, these started to be phased in during the first couple of years of World War I. And this is the first one built to fire smokeless powder explicitly. To do that, they had to strengthen things. They also had to enlarge the cylinders just a smidge, the chambers of the cylinders. But otherwise, they kept the design pretty well the same. These were routinely made with 4-inch barrels. However, for the first time, 5 and 6-inch were options and were made in limited quantities. So you'll see the Mark V. It's kind of the last of the old style Webley revolvers. Well, that was replaced by probably the most famous of the Webley variants. This is the Mark VI, known as the World War I model. As you can see, it's pretty radically different. It has a 6-inch barrel, as standard. The front sight is pinned in, thus it's removable. I think the pin's a little more visible on this side here. Okay. You could take it out and replace your front sights. The grips went from that kind of bird's head shape to a very squared off target shape, and now these are made out of hard rubber instead of wood. The action, however, remained virtually the same. Still a top brake. Still firing a smokeless powder .455 cartridge. Still double single action. yeah, these were used to great effect in World War I. This was a great gun for the war. The longer barrel gave it some range out in the fields, but since it was a revolver, it was damn reliable in the dirt, mud, grime of the trenches. So much so that they developed quite a few accessories for these, including a shoulder stock. They developed a bayonet adapted from a French gros. So yeah, imagine this with a stock and a bayonet on it. Little trench raiding gun. They also developed some of the early speed loaders for this, so they could get it into action fast. So this was, for World War I and trench raids and that kind of thing was very popular. Also, a lot of British pilots carried these, as well as the Royal Navy. Pretty much anyone who could get their hands on one carried these. This was officially adopted in 1915, and they started to see, actual field use around 1916. By 1918, they were quite common. Well, these were manufactured up to this point all by Webley and Scott, who discontinued after the war their production line in 1923 because they were moving on to other things, which we'll get to in a minute. At the same time, the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield started producing Webley Mark VI revolvers in 1921, and they continued this until 1925, give or take, maybe 1926. Along with the Enfields, if you watched our Enfield video, you'll know that in 1926 the British changed their naming system. So this went from being known as the Webley Revolver Mark VI to the number 1 Mark VI revolver. Just a little nomenclature change. Well, these would be officially replaced in the 30s. However, a lot of them were brought back into service in 1940 because of World War II, and remained as a substitute standard through 1945. After the war, they were declared obsolete in 1947. However, a lot of them still kind of remained out in the field or in the hands of police until the early 60s. I mean, they were around. And a lot of them were still in really good shape because they had not been fired a lot, really. The British didn't allot a lot of ammo for training, so most of these were only fired a couple of shells every few months, and they were still in outstanding condition. Also, like this one, most of them were FTR repaired and gone over at least once or twice. This one here is just an honest World War I model. It's either 1917 or 1918, I can't remember, but it's a latter part of the war gun. Very honest World War I Mark VI. It's a really neat action. It does have a heavier trigger than the other one. Hate dry firing guns. Well, just as a little aside, since I had it on hand, let's look at one more gun in 455. This is a Smith & Wesson hand ejector, which the British called the Mark II. This is a typical large frame. This is actually the same frame that the US 1917 revolver would be based on. Typical 6-shot hand ejecting gun. Well, in 1914, the British didn't have enough guns, as I said, so they actually purchased 5,500 hand ejectors from Smith & Wesson. Now, these would be what we call today a triple lock. They would also have a shrouded ejector. They purchased those, and they decided, well, we need more. But they wanted some simplifications, both to speed up production, lower costs, and they were worried about the triple lock and the shrouded ejector shroud, which would have been here, catching mud and grime in the trenches, so they simplified them. These would become known as the Mark II, like this one here. Between 1915 and 1917, Smith & Wesson would deliver about 70,000 Mark II revolvers to both Britain and Canada, and this was a substitute standard in both countries. Good, durable, simple revolver. Double single action. Kind of more modern style firing pin. It has a rather massive 6.5-inch barrel. That said, even though the barrel is longer, it has a more svelte grip than the Enfield, and I love Smith & Wesson, so I'm biased. I think they're really nice guns, but I love the feel of this thing in the hand. Trigger is, of course, a little bit heavy in double action, but very smooth. The grip's a little bit smaller, but you know, it's functional-wise, it's the same as a Webley, really. But yeah, Britain used about 75,000 of these total, including both marks, and they would be reissued for World War II as well, and then eventually sold off as surplus, as this one was. Alrighty, well, that's a little look at the 455s. We'll move on. Alright, moving on. These are the 38 caliber British revolvers. And actually I debated which to show you first, the Webley or the Enfield. I'm afraid we'll talk about the Enfield first just because it was the official standard issue. In 1919, after World War I, the British military was kind of analyzing what had happened and trying to modernize and whatnot. They decided that the old Webley 455 revolver was too large and heavy, along with having a too large and heavy cartridge. That round had initially been developed for use in Africa and the colonies, you know, against natives and wave attacks and all of that. Well, World War I was a different kind of war, and they wanted to make their revolver more of a lighter weight defensive sidearm. So in the 1920s, they tested several cartridges, and they basically ended up adopting a modified 38 Smith & Wesson as a 38-200. It had a 200 grain bullet, so still rather large. Well, to go along with the new round, they needed a new revolver. What I'm holding here is an Enfield No. 2 Mark I. This went into this went into development in 1920, 26, 28, it's a little fuzzy there, late 20s, and it was led by Captain Boys at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. It fires the new round. It's still a top break, self-ejecting, automatic ejecting 6-shot revolver. Still has a double single action. Has the more updated style firing pin that we see on a lot of newer guns. But yeah, this was adopted in the middle of 1932 as the new standard issue sidearm of Britain, and was used by many of the other nations in the Commonwealth. So basically it's a scaled down Webley. And that's kind of where we get into some trouble. That is the Enfield. That's what Britain officially adopted, and it was developed at their own small arms factory. The problem was Webley and Scott had been working on something incredibly similar beginning in 1923. They had what they called the Mark III, which was a 38 caliber revolver scaled down for police use. Well, when they heard the military was looking for a new gun, they developed what they called the Mark IV, which they basically put up against the Enfield. The Enfield won, but they claimed foul. They said that the Enfield was just a copy, that they had sent some early Mark IVs to the Enfield factory for trial and evaluation and all that, and that they had basically had their design ripped off. Enfield, the government essentially, responded that, oh no, the Enfield's a different gun, pointed out that none of the parts are interchangeable, that the lock work is different, and both of those factors are true, but these are undeniably similar guns. So it went back and forth throughout the 30s. It went to court. The first round at court, Webley and Scott lost. The second round, they actually were awarded some money for development. At any rate, the Enfield was adopted, but they could not produce enough No. 2s for World War II, so this became a substitute standard issue in 1942 anyway. So it went into government service and ended up purchasing from Webley and Scott. So quite a few did go into military service. These would remain in production in one form or another all the way through the 70s. Now this one I'm holding here is a wartime example. It has wartime finish stamped on it, so the machining and the bluing is much simplified for the war. But it's still a reliable, durable little gun. Well, also during the war, and really before, in 1938, a double action only version of the Enfield was adopted as the number 2 Mark I Star. Now originally these still had wooden grips. First they added the thumb rest, and then later they switched to these Bakelite grips known as the Mark II grips. And they went to the thumb rest because it made it easier to fire in double action. It is a double action only. They did lighten the hammer spring later, so it was a little more effective. But basically, yeah, the Mark II, the Mark I Star, the number 2 Mark I Star, became kind of a de facto standard. After 1938, you don't see too many of the double single action Enfields anymore. And those you do, a lot of them were converted to DAO anyway. They also had a number 2 Mark I Star, which lacked the basically hammer firing pin safety. But these were declared quickly unsafe, and most of them were retrofitted to be Mark I Stars beginning in 1944 as the war started to turn in favor of the Allies. The reason they did it initially was, of course, cost savings and all of that. Now, these were manufactured by Enfield. They were also manufactured by Singer and Albion in Scotland, so they were manufactured by 3 factories. The older 455 Webleys, they produced about 125,000 during a several decade run. With these Enfields, I've seen production numbers from as low as 270,000 all the way up to 380,000. I kind of assume the ones with the 380,000 might be including both the Webley and Scott Mark IV and the Enfield number 2 Mark I, but I don't know. But the point remains that they produced these in larger numbers than the older 455s. These were actually not replaced in service until 1957 by the high power and weren't declared obsolete until 1963. Even, of course, then, a lot of them remained in service. But yeah, this is the Enfield Top Break 38 200 revolver. This was actually the first revolver I ever purchased many years ago. It's gone through an FTR, it's definitely been through the wars. These are really popular with tank crews because of the spurless hammer. They're also carried by flyers because they felt the revolver was safer than an automatic. But yeah, it's an interesting gun, and as far as revolvers go, quite modern. These mostly came out with 5-inch barrels. However, some of the Webley and Scotts also could be had with 4 and even 3, but 5 was the standard by this point. Yeah, this was the official service sidearm of Britain during World War II, with this Webley and Scott over here being a limited substitute standard. We'll move on. And for our final British handgun, we have the FN High Power. Well, sort of. How this got into British and Canadian service is a long story, and I'm just going to try to hit the major points, probably get a few numbers wrong. If you want the kind of blow-by-blow and details, feel free to check out our blog article on these guns. For that matter, on anything. You know, we have a little more detail on the blog. The High Power is a very famous gun, but just for those who aren't so much in the know, it was John Browning's final design with help from, my speech says Diendenouve Save, but that can't be, I think it's Savre, last name, of FN, who helped out. It is a single action only. It has a Browning style little thumb safety here. Browning style tipping barrel. External release. Now, its biggest claim to fame was that it had a double stack 13 round magazine. Now, this was not the first double stack gun. If you've watched our French video, you'll see the Savage 1907 probably lays claim to that. It was a double stack 10 shot, but it was a smaller gun. This is one of the earliest high capacity guns, and actually it would not be surpassed until the French MAB PA-15 of the late 60s. Anyway, the one I'm holding here was produced by John Inglis, and it went into British service. Okay. In 1939, we have to go to the Chinese. They initially placed an order with FN of Belgium for a number of high powers, several thousand. However, the Nazis invaded, and the order could not be even started, honestly. So the Chinese were still wanting high powers. And since they were fighting the Japanese, they were allies of the Allies, of Canada, Britain, the USA. They were touring the John Inglis factory in 1941, where they were ordering Bren LMGs and 8mm Mauser. Well, while there, the Chinese representative of the team asked the factory if they could do a pistol. They said, well, we've never done a pistol, but what the hell? We can do it. So the Chinese said, well, we'll take 180,000 if you can do it. So they, okay, well, we're going to try it out. Well, throughout 1942, they were planning. In 1943, a lot of things happened. The order was confirmed. The Canadian government agreed. The British government assigned the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield to reverse engineer the high power and gave 2 examples. At first, FN and Savre wanted royalties, and the British and the Canadians said no. They were upset. The Chinese put some pressure. Some of the British government put some pressure. So they agreed to pay royalties. Also, an agreement was signed where English would not produce more than 250,000 pistols total. So made FN and Sev happy. So they got on board. They helped out. At the same time, Enfield delivered some blueprints to Inglis in the late part of the year. So they had some blueprints to go with. They had the help of the original designer and factory. They were going to make this happen, and they did. As early as February of 1944, the first Canadian-produced high powers were coming off the production line. Well, by this point, after a couple of years of talking about this gun, the British and the Canadian militaries also became interested. So after the first little shipment was sent to China of about 4,000 guns, 1,000 were actually sent to the British military. Now you're going to see a bunch of numbers throughout 1944 and 45. What it eventually boils down to is, in the later part of 1944, the Chinese contract was canceled. This was because by that point, the Chinese weren't so much fighting the Japanese, they were fighting their own internal civil war with the communists and all that. Also, it was very difficult to get supplies from India to China at the time, and handguns were a low priority. In all, about 40,000 were sent to China, but the rest ended up going to the Canadian and the British militaries. The British would take 10,000, the Canadians would take 8,500, so on and so forth, and they'd keep taking small batches as English would produce them. In the end, they both ended up with several thousand pistols, and in total, English produced about 152,000. Well, in early 1945, the original number 1 Mark I was replaced by the number 2 Mark I, which was specifically designed for the needs of the Commonwealth. The number 1 Mark I was the Chinese contract version. It was slotted for a shoulder stock back here, and it had an adjustable tangent rear sight. They wanted to kind of make these into longer range guns. Well, the British and the Canadians weren't interested in that. They wanted something cheaper, faster to produce, and they recognized it was just a handgun. So they went to the simplified rear sight and weren't messing with shoulder stocks. Well, the number 2 Mark I came out in early 1945, and they would end up producing about 92,000 of those, and about 60,000 of the original Chinese number 1s had been made. So more number 2s like this gun here. And then, of course, all of those were delivered to the Canadian and the British military. So by the end, they all had quite a few guns, and quite a few of the Chinese guns, at least 20,000, ended up going to the British and Canadians as well. This basically became the first automatic gun, self-loading pistol, used by the British. In World War II, it was the official standard sidearm of the SAS, and would remain so until being replaced by the SIG 226. The Canadians also used quite a few of these. In 1954, after the war, this became standard issue in the British military, and it was actually officially type-classed and adopted in 1957 as the L9A1. The early L9A1s were English guns from World War II, but as Britain needed more, they would purchase from FN in Belgium, who obviously had been liberated from the Nazis in 1944, and they would in the 60s they began purchasing essentially commercial high powers. I mean, they were militarized, of course, but basically just like the standard, or what are often called the Mark I, erroneously. They would also purchase some Mark IIs, and they would actually purchase some Mark IIIs as late as the 1990s. And they pretty much look like a standard one, except for having this little lanyard ring on the back here. But yeah, this one here is in English. It went through the British FTR program. It has a Sunkerite type finish on it. Nice, well-worn gun, but real smooth. I like it. It's got an honest old look to it, non-import marked and so on. But yeah, the high power was really the first automatic to go into British service. It would replace the Webleys and the Enfield revolvers, and would remain a very tried and true gun all the way through the Cold War era. I didn't mention this, most of you know, this does fire 9x19 Parabellum, also known as Luger, later called NATO, but it does fire a very standardized cartridge, same as the British Sten gun. So they already had that cartridge on hand for other guns, so that wasn't a problem for them. But just a really solid gun, the high power. Feels good in the hand, nice balance, not too big, not too small, simple but durable, single action trigger. 13 rounds is more than enough capacity. But yeah, this is our little video on British military issue sidearms. If you have any questions, please post them below. Any comments, they're always welcome. We really like those, and we always appreciate you viewing and tuning in. Well, this is Misha. Talk to you next time.